When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, German tank crews rolled into Soviet territory with confidence. They had crushed Poland in weeks, swept through France in a matter of months, and their panzer divisions were considered the finest mechanized force the world had ever seen. The German tankers knew their equipment, trusted their training, and believed in their tactical superiority. Then they encountered something that would shake that confidence to its core: the T-34. The initial shock came not just from meeting a new enemy tank, but from the realization that their standard weapons were virtually useless against it. German accounts from those first days describe crews firing 23 rounds from 37mm anti-tank guns at a single T-34, only managing to jam its turret ring without destroying the vehicle. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Here was a Soviet tank that seemed almost impervious to the weapons the Germans had relied upon throughout their previous campaigns. The T-34 that German forces encountered in 1941 mounted a 76.2mm F-34 gun, a weapon significantly more powerful than the short-barreled 50mm guns on most German panzers at that time. But the gun was only part of the story. The real innovation lay in the T-34's design philosophy. Soviet engineers had created a tank with sloped armor, a revolutionary approach that fundamentally changed the mathematics of tank warfare. The sloping of the armor plates meant that an enemy shell striking the T-34's frontal armor would hit at an angle rather than perpendicular to the surface. This simple geometric principle dramatically increased the effective thickness of the armor without adding weight. A 45mm armor plate set at an angle could offer the same protection as a much thicker vertical plate. German rounds that would have penetrated conventional tank armor simply bounced off the glacis plate of the T-34. Before you continue listening, if you're finding this story fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We bring you these incredible real stories from World War II history, and your support helps us continue. Drop a comment below telling us what aspect of tank warfare interests you most. The German response to the T-34 was initially improvised and desperate. The only weapon in their arsenal that could reliably destroy a T-34 from the front was the 88mm anti-aircraft gun, the famous flak gun that had proven its worth against tanks in North Africa. But these weapons were scarce on the Eastern Front in 1941, and using anti-aircraft guns as anti-tank weapons was a tactical compromise born of necessity rather than planning. German tank crews found themselves in an impossible situation. Their standard tanks, the Panzer III and Panzer IV, had similar thickness of armor to the T-34, but without the advantage of sloping. Their guns had shorter barrels and fired shells at lower velocity, which meant both that they were vulnerable to the T-34's powerful cannon and that their chances of penetrating the Soviet tank's frontal armor were slim. In a head-to-head engagement, the T-34 held almost every advantage. However, the story of the T-34 in 1941 and 42 is not simply a story of Soviet superiority. Despite the tank's extraordinary technical capabilities, Soviet armored forces suffered catastrophic losses in the first years of the war. The reasons for this paradox reveal the complex reality of armored warfare, where the quality of the weapon is only one factor among many. Soviet tank crews in the early war period were often poorly trained and inexperienced. The massive purges of the 1930s had decimated the Red Army's officer corps, removing many of the most experienced tank commanders. The crews that went into battle in 1941 frequently lacked basic tactical knowledge. Individual tank commanders suffered from poor situational awareness due to inadequate vision devices, and the fact that they were preoccupied with gunnery duties in the T-34's cramped two-man turret. The two-man turret design proved to be a critical flaw. In German tanks, the commander could focus on battlefield awareness, coordinating with other tanks, and making tactical decisions while a separate gunner handled the main weapon. In the T-34, the commander had to perform both roles simultaneously. This meant Soviet tank commanders were constantly torn between searching for threats and engaging targets, unable to do either task effectively. German observers noted that T-34 platoons would seldom engage three separate targets independently, but would instead tend to focus on a single target selected by the platoon leader. This meant that Soviet tank units lost the advantage of distributed firepower. While three tanks should theoretically be able to engage three different enemies simultaneously, Soviet T-34 platoons often functioned as if they were a single weapon system with backup units rather than three independent fighting vehicles. The Germans also documented that the T-34 was very slow to find and engage targets. While Soviet tanks were searching for the enemy, German panzers could typically get off 3 rounds for every one fired by the T-34. This rate of fire disparity was devastating in combat. Even if the T-34 had superior armor and firepower on paper, being hit 3 times before you could return fire often meant the difference between survival and destruction. The gun sights and range-finding equipment for the F-34 main gun were rather crude, especially compared to German optics. This affected both accuracy and the ability to engage at long ranges. German tank crews, with their superior optics and training, could identify and engage Soviet tanks at distances where the T-34 crews couldn't even see them clearly. The technological advantage of sloped armor and a powerful gun became irrelevant if you were destroyed before you could bring those advantages to bear. As 1942 progressed, the Germans adapted. They fielded large numbers of improved anti-tank weapons, particularly the 75mm PaK-40 anti-tank gun. The Panzer IV was up-armored, with hull armor increased to 80mm, which provided good protection at normal combat distances. More significantly, the Germans began developing and deploying heavy tanks specifically designed to counter the T-34, the Tiger and the Panther. The Tiger wing, with its 88mm gun and heavy armor, was essentially immune to the T-34's 76mm gun when engaged from the front. The Panther, which incorporated sloped armor similar to the T-34's design philosophy, but with German engineering and optics, was an even more direct response to the Soviet tank. By 1943, the T-34's initial advantages had largely evaporated. Soviet tankers found themselves facing German vehicles they could barely damage while being vulnerable to German fire at ranges where they couldn't effectively return it. The loss ratios became unsustainable. Soviet armored forces destroyed 15,000 tanks in 1942 alone. Even with the Soviet Union's massive industrial capacity and ability to produce tanks in enormous quantities, these losses represented a crisis. The Soviets had relocated their armament factories far to the east, out of reach of German bombers, and by 1943, these factories were producing tanks at an incredible rate. But production alone couldn't solve the problem if the tanks being produced were increasingly outclassed on the battlefield. Soviet leadership recognized that the technological balance had shifted. The T-34's 76mm gun, which had been more than adequate in 1941, could no longer compete with the new generation of German armor. What was needed was not minor modifications, but a significant upgrade that would restore the T-34's combat effectiveness. The solution came in the form of the 85mm gun. This high-velocity weapon had been developed for anti-aircraft use, but was adapted for tank mounting. The 85mm ZIS S-53 gun was a transformative upgrade, providing dramatically increased firepower compared to the original 76mm weapon. But the gun alone wasn't enough. The weapon required a larger turret to accommodate it, and Soviet engineers took the opportunity to redesign the turret to address one of the T-34's most critical weaknesses. The new turret was designed for a 3-man crew. This seemingly simple change revolutionized the T-34's combat effectiveness. Now the tank commander could focus on commanding, maintaining situational awareness, and coordinating with other vehicles, while a dedicated gunner operated the main weapon. This separation of roles increased the rate of fire and overall effectiveness of the tank dramatically. The 85mm gun's capabilities were impressive. It could penetrate the turret front of a Tiger Y tank from 500 meters and the driver's front plate from 300 meters at a side angle of 30 degrees. Testing after the war, when American forces captured T-34-85s during the Korean War, confirmed that the gun could penetrate 4.1 inches of armor at 1,000 yards. This performance was similar to the high-velocity armor-piercing rounds used by American tanks and represented a quantum leap over the original 76mm gun. The Soviet official data showed the 85mm armor-piercing ballistic cap shell could penetrate 110mm of armor at 500 meters. But actual combat testing revealed something even more significant. The 85mm gun performed better against sloped armor in real combat conditions than the penetration tables suggested. In tests against captured Tiger Y tanks, the 85mm gun penetrated not just into one side of the lower hull, but completely through and out the other side, despite the combined armor thickness being 124mm. The deployment of the T-34-85 began in early 1944, and German tank crews initially had no idea what they were facing. From a distance, the T-34-85 looked similar to the earlier models. The silhouette was recognizable as a T-34, and German crews had developed tactics for engaging these Soviet tanks based on nearly 3 years of combat experience. They knew the effective ranges, the vulnerable points, and the limitations of the 76mm gun. What they didn't know was that the Soviets had fundamentally transformed the T-34's combat capabilities. The longer barrel of the 85mm gun was noticeable to a trained observer, measuring 4.645 meters in length. But in the confusion and speed of armored combat, especially at longer ranges or in poor visibility conditions, German crews often didn't realize they were facing an upgraded model until it was too late. The psychological impact of this surprise cannot be overstated. German tank crews had learned through hard experience that they could engage T-34s with the 76mm gun from ranges and angles where the Soviet tanks couldn't effectively respond. Panther and Tiger crews knew they were essentially invulnerable to the T-34's main gun from the front. This knowledge informed their tactics and gave them confidence in combat. Now, suddenly, German tanks that should have been safe were being penetrated at ranges where T-34s shouldn't have been able to harm them. Tigers that had been nearly invincible against T-34-76s found their armor being pierced. Panthers that had dominated Soviet armor discovered they were in genuine danger. The tactical calculations that German crews had relied upon were suddenly obsolete, but many crews didn't realize this until they were already under fire. The longer gun barrel of the T-34-85, while providing increased velocity and penetration, came with its own challenges. Tank commanders had to be careful not to drive the barrel into the ground on bumpy roads or in combat. Soviet tank commander A.K. Rodkin noted that the tank could dig the ground with the gun barrel in the smallest ditch, potentially filling it with dirt. This was a real concern in the rough terrain of the Eastern Front, where roads were often primitive and cross-country movement was necessary. But despite this limitation, the T-34-85 represented a restoration of the technological balance that had shifted so decisively in Germany's favor by 1943. Soviet tank crews now had a weapon that could genuinely threaten German heavy armor from the front at meaningful combat ranges. Combined with improving crew training and the massive numerical superiority the Soviets could bring to bear, the T-34-85 became a formidable weapon system. The turret modifications also included improved optics, though these still lagged behind German equipment. The addition of the third crew member meant that Soviet tank platoons could now operate more like their German counterparts, with tank commanders able to maintain situational awareness and coordinate fire while gunners focused on target acquisition and engagement. The rate of fire improved and Soviet tanks became more effective at identifying and engaging multiple targets. If you're enjoying this deep dive into tank warfare history, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and have notifications turned on. We release new videos regularly about the real stories and technical details of World War II combat. Share this video with anyone interested in military history. The timing of the T-34-85's introduction was significant. By early 1944, the strategic situation on the Eastern Front had shifted decisively. The Soviets had won the crucial battles of Stalingrad and Kursk, and German forces were in general retreat. The arrival of the upgraded T-34 coincided with a period when Soviet tactical doctrine and crew training had also improved dramatically from the dark days of 1941 and 42. German forces in 1944 faced not just upgraded Soviet tanks, but better trained crews operating within an improved command structure. The combination was devastating. While German tanks like the Panther and Tiger still had advantages in certain situations, particularly in long-range gunnery duels where superior German optics could be exploited, the overall balance had shifted. The production numbers tell part of the story. The Soviet Union manufactured tens of thousands of T-34s throughout the war, and production continued after the war ended. By contrast, Germany produced far fewer heavy tanks. The Tiger Buy, for all its fearsome capabilities, was manufactured in relatively small numbers. Germany simply couldn't match Soviet production capacity, and with the T-34-85, the quality gap had narrowed sufficiently that quantity became the decisive factor. The T-34-85's effective range was up to 1,900 meters, with a maximum range of 2 to 3 kilometers. This meant Soviet tank crews could engage German armor at distances where their improved but still inferior optics were adequate for target acquisition. The high-velocity 85mm gun could defeat German armor at these ranges, negating many of the tactical advantages German crews had relied upon. Combat reports from 1944 and 45 demonstrate the T-34-85's effectiveness. The tank wasn't a wonder weapon that rendered German armor obsolete, but it was a capable fighting vehicle that could compete on relatively equal terms with most German tanks it encountered. When combined with Soviet numerical superiority and improving tactics, this was sufficient to maintain the momentum of the Soviet advance. German tank crews adapted their tactics as they came to understand what they were facing. They learned to identify the T-34-85 by its longer gun barrel and larger turret, and they adjusted their engagement ranges and tactics accordingly. But by this point in the war, Germany's strategic situation was deteriorating rapidly. Fuel shortages limited tank mobility, replacement vehicles, and trained crews were increasingly scarce, and the multiple fronts were stretching German forces beyond their capacity to respond effectively. The T-34-85 also saw extensive combat after World War II, serving in numerous conflicts, including the Korean War, where it faced American tanks. American analysis of captured T-34-85s confirmed the weapon's capabilities and noted its effectiveness at medium ranges. While American and later NATO tanks would eventually surpass the T-34-85's capabilities, during the crucial period of 1944 and 45, it was one of the most effective medium tanks in service. The story of the T-34's evolution from the 76mm gun to the 85mm weapon illustrates a fundamental truth about armored warfare. Technological advantage is temporary. The T-34 shocked German forces in 1941 with capabilities that seemed almost impossible to counter. Within 2 years, German adaptations and new tank designs had largely negated those advantages. The Soviet response in the form of the T-34-85 restored a competitive balance just as the strategic situation was turning decisively against Germany. The element of surprise when German tank crews first encountered the T-34-85 was significant but not decisive by itself. What made the upgraded T-34 truly effective was the combination of improved firepower, better crew ergonomics with the three-man turret, and the broader context of improving Soviet tactics and overwhelming numerical superiority. German crews could adapt to the new threat, but adaptation requires time and resources, neither of which Germany possessed in adequate quantities by 1944. The technical specifications of the 85mm gun were impressive, but what made them meaningful in combat was the way they interacted with other factors: crew training, tactical doctrine, numerical strength, logistical support, and strategic context. The gun could penetrate Tiger armor from certain angles and ranges, but achieving those conditions in actual combat required skilled crews operating within effective tactical frameworks. By the time the T-34-85 entered service, Soviet forces had developed these capabilities to a degree that would have seemed impossible in the desperate defensive battles of 1941. The longer engagement ranges enabled by the high-velocity 85mm gun also reduced the importance of the optics disparity between German and Soviet tanks. While German sights remained superior throughout the war, the gap in effective engagement range narrowed when Soviet guns could threaten German armor at distances of 1,000 meters or more. This reduced the zone in which German crews could exploit their optical advantage to engage Soviet tanks while remaining relatively safe from return fire. The three-man turret's impact on combat effectiveness cannot be overstated. The separation of commander and gunner roles meant Soviet tank platoons could finally operate with something approaching the tactical flexibility German units had enjoyed throughout the war. Tank commanders could now focus on the battle unfolding around them, coordinating with infantry and other tanks, identifying threats, and making tactical decisions without simultaneously trying to aim and fire the main gun. This organizational change, combined with the improved firepower of the 85mm gun, transformed the T-34 from a tank with excellent potential, limited by critical flaws, into a genuinely effective combat vehicle. The T-34-85 wasn't perfect. Soviet tanks would continue to lag behind German vehicles in optics quality and mechanical reliability, but it was good enough, and in the context of 1944's Eastern Front, good enough combined with massive numerical superiority was devastating. German tank crews in the final year of the war faced an increasingly impossible situation. They were outnumbered, often outgunned, and operating with chronic shortages of fuel, ammunition, and replacement vehicles. The arrival of the T-34-85, with its ability to threaten German armor at ranges previously considered safe, was one more factor in a deteriorating tactical and strategic situation. The surprise element of the T-34-85's introduction gave Soviet forces a temporary advantage as German crews adjusted to the new threat. But even after German forces adapted their tactics, the fundamental reality remained. The Soviets had restored technological parity at a time when they held overwhelming advantages in numbers and strategic position. The upgraded T-34 didn't win the war by itself, but it ensured that German forces couldn't regain the technological edge they had briefly held in 1943. The story of German tank crews discovering too late that they were facing an 85mm gun instead of the 76mm weapon they expected is repeated in numerous combat accounts from 1944. In the chaos and speed of armored combat, the difference in gun barrel length wasn't always immediately apparent, especially at longer ranges or when vehicles were partially concealed. German crews operating on assumptions built from years of combat experience suddenly found those assumptions were fatally wrong. This narrative of technological surprise and adaptation is one of the defining themes of the Eastern Front's tank warfare. Both sides continuously modified and upgraded their vehicles in response to enemy innovations. The difference was that by 1944, Germany's capacity to respond effectively was diminishing while Soviet capabilities were expanding. The T-34-85 entered service at a moment when its technical capabilities could be fully exploited within a broader military context that favored the Soviet Union. The legacy of the T-34-85 extended far beyond World War II. The tank served in numerous armies and conflicts throughout the Cold War era, proving the fundamental soundness of its design. But its most significant impact was during the crucial period from early 1944 through the end of the war in Europe, when it helped Soviet forces maintain the momentum of their advance against German forces that could no longer count on technological superiority to offset numerical disadvantages. For German tank crews encountering the T-34-85 for the first time, the experience must have been profoundly unsettling. They had learned through hard experience how to fight T-34s, what ranges were safe, what angles of attack were effective. Suddenly, those lessons were obsolete, and they were being destroyed by tanks they thought they understood. That moment of recognition, when a German crew realized the T-34 firing at them wasn't the vehicle they expected, but something far more dangerous, came too late for many. The high-velocity 85mm gun had already spoken, and by the time they understood what they were facing, the battle was often already decided. This is the story of how technological evolution in warfare can surprise even experienced combat veterans, how advantages are temporary, and how the introduction of the T-34-85's 85mm gun changed the calculus of tank warfare on the Eastern Front at a critical moment in history. The German tank crews, who never knew what hit them, learned too late that the Soviets had fundamentally transformed their most numerous tank into a weapon system capable of competing with the best Germany could field, at a time when Germany could no longer afford any additional disadvantages on the battlefield.